Welcome back to Let Us Think About It. I'm Ryder Richards, and we're diving back into Richard Rorty's Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, written in 1989. Last time in Step 86, we tackled Part 1, the first 3 chapters, where Rorty shook the ground under language, self, and community, arguing that they're contingent. They're products of a historical chance, not eternal truths. Language is a toolkit. Selves are sculpted by words, and liberal societies are experiments, not divine blueprints. Today, we're going to hit part 2. This is chapters 4 through 6, where Rorty sharpens his focus on irony, and he introduces the concept of the liberal Ironist, a figure who doubts their own beliefs privately while fighting cruelty publicly. Once again, Rorty's ideas are seductive. I like them, but I'm also, of course, skeptical. That's part of our job here. So his split between public and private, it feels a little too neat, at least for me. And his dismissal of universal truths risks undermining moral conviction, because if you formulate your own truths, do they not turn back into a moral conviction that is somehow, unbounded? Let's unpack the Ironist versus Metaphysician, revel in Rorty's witty jabs at philosophy's old guard, and poke holes where his arguments might wobble a little bit. So grab your toolbox. It's time to tinker with irony. Step 1. Defining the Ironist and Metaphysician. Doubt versus dogma. So Rorty kicks off part 2 by drawing a line in the sand. Ironists versus metaphysicians. Yeah, it's on. An ironist, he says, meets 3 conditions. She has radical and continuing doubts about the final vocabulary she currently uses, because she's dazzled by other vocabularies. She knows her current words can't resolve those doubts, and she doesn't think her vocabulary is closer to reality than others. So, yeah, the Ironists, channeling Donald Davidson here, reject the idea of stepping outside language to check it against reality. And with somebody like Heidegger, they embrace language's historical contingency. Now, as Rorty puts it, Ironists see vocabularies as tools for coping, not the bits of a jigsaw puzzle fitting together some sort of pre-existing truth. Metaphysicians, on the other hand, are kind of old school truth hunters. They believe in a final vocabulary that captures the way the world is. Now, Rorty skewers their quest, and he's really critical of Plato and Kant for assuming built-in criteria that let us spot the right vocabulary, that is, the right way of thinking. He writes, "Metaphysicians think our contemporary vocabularies are close enough to the right one to help us formulate premises leading to the right conclusions." For them, right means grasping real essence, not just what works for those who speak as we do. And this goes back to an earlier episode we did on the word good. So Rorty's critique here, it kind of stings, right? Metaphysicians treat alternative vocabularies like puzzle pieces, reducible, dispensable, or capable of being united into one grand super vocabulary. And that's a quote. Embracing their pragmatic utility despite its blindness and potential cruelty. So let's look at a quick example here. Rorty takes a swing at traditional philosophy's obsession with facts and meanings, arguing that they kind of assume language is a medium for representing reality, representing the truth. He cites Davidson's attack on the scheme-content model, where philosophers like Kant, Immanuel Kant, posit a gap between our concepts and raw reality. And also, Zizek uses this gap term quite a bit. Rorty quips, the trouble with arguments against the use of a familiar and time-honored vocabulary is they are expected to be phrased in that very vocabulary. Now, this exposes a logical trap here. You can't disprove a vocabulary using its own terms. It's kind of, as Rorty says, would be like lifting yourself by your own bootstraps. Now, the counterexample to this might be Rorty's Ironists. This sounds liberating. Who doesn't want to self-create their unique being free of the restrictions that came before? But what if doubting every vocabulary paralyzes action? Now, take a moral crisis, like confronting systemic injustice. If I'm an Ironist, I'm endlessly questioning my terms, justice and equality, equity. I might hesitate when decisive action is needed if I'm constantly questioning. Now, philosophers like John Rawls, whom Rorty later praises, he offered principled frameworks, such as the veil of ignorance, that anchor moral reasoning. Now, Rorty's dismissal of such frameworks as Metaphysicians' Dogma, it risks really leaving us adrift, unable to really commit when the stakes are high. So, okay, our key takeaways from part 1 here is the Ironists embrace doubt and treat vocabularies as tools, while metaphysicians chase a final truth. Rorty's vision here is pretty dynamic, but this kind of allergy to universal criteria, that could weaken our moral resolve. Step 2. Ironist versus metaphysician methods. This is redescription versus resolution. So the Ironist and metaphysician don't just differ in outlook, they clash in method. Metaphysicians see philosophy as a quest to know about certain general and important things, resolving contradictions between beliefs by proposing distinctions, categorizing, and building theories that converge on the way things really are. So Rorty mocks their faith in uncontroversial premises, arguing it's a pipe dream. So Ironists, by contrast, see theories as gradual substitutions of a new vocabulary for an old one. They call metaphysicians' intuitions merely platitudes, and progress as more of a change made rather than a fact discovered. So Rorty's Ironist method here is dialectic, that is, pitting vocabularies against each other, relying on redescription rather than inference. He writes, the Ironist hopes that by introducing new jargon, people will stop asking questions phrased in the old words. So logic for Ironists is ancillary to dialectic, while metaphysicians see dialectic as mere rhetoric. Rorty's goal here for Ironists is private perfection, that is, a self-creation through redescription of yourself, right? Aiming to become a person who could not have existed before one's particular vocabulary. Now, as an example, Rorty, he kind of targets metaphysicians' obsession with resolving contradictions, like the place of consciousness in a world of molecules. He argues these are kind of factitious theoretical quarrels. And he cites Wittgenstein and Davidson here, who ask these more pragmatic questions like, does our use of these words get in the way of our use of those other words? Like, we're just dancing around words here. And Rorty ridicules philosophers like Descartes for stirring up difficulties nobody else ever sees, trapping themselves in logical puzzles that practical tools simply sidestep. And later, he praises Derrida's ability to bypass logic with kind of narrative fancy. Now, taking all that into account, a counterexample here might be that Rorty's dialectic sounds creative, but it risks intellectual anarchy. If we only redescribe without seeking coherence, how do we avoid contradictions that undermine trust? For example, in science, metaphysicians like Karl Popper insist on falsifiability to refine theories, ensuring that they align with evidence. Now, Rorty's Ironist, dodging such a criteria, might redescribe gravity as cosmic poetry and lose predictive power in the future because of this. Without some sort of shared standards, redescription can become whimsical, eroding collective progress. Now, our key takeaway here is that Ironists redescribe to create new selves, while metaphysicians resolve contradictions to uncover truth. So Rorty's method sparks innovation, but without anchors or handrails, it risks incoherence. Step 3. The liberal Ironist, splitting private and public. So Rorty's star player is the liberal Ironist, And this is a person who juggles private doubt with public hope. She's a liberal per Judith Sklar, believing cruelty is the worst thing we can do, as we mentioned last episode, and an Ironist, aware her beliefs are contingent. So Rorty writes, the liberal Ironist combines a commitment to reducing cruelty with an acknowledgement of the contingency of her own beliefs and desires. Her challenge, the vocabulary of self-creation, is necessarily private, unshared, and unsuited to argument, while the vocabulary of justice is necessarily public and shared. So Rorty's solution here, this public-private divide, is to just keep them separate. Pursue private perfection at home, your private self-creation, but join the public fight against cruelty. Rorty warns that irony in public can really erode solidarity, kind of like satire and other things like that, cynicism. It can make you seem really cynical, while liberal hope in private stifles self-creation. To be liberally hopeful at home all the time, searching out these metaphysical ideas, might actually keep you from self-creating or being unique. Now, he says, there's no way to bring self-creation together with justice at the level of theory. This really rejects Plato's dream of fusing personal and communal good. So his liberal utopia, Rorty's liberal utopia, is a society where irony is universal, letting citizens be as privatistic, irrationalist, and aestheticist as they please, without harming others. So that actually sounds great, right? But let's look at an example of Rorty here, because he really dismisses Plato's attempt to answer the question, why is it in one's interest to be just? This to Rorty is a metaphysical fantasy. He argues it assumes a common human nature, uniting private and public, a notion that Ironists really reject. And Plato's logic, Rorty says, leads to transparent attempts to make altruism look more reasonable than it is, trapping philosophers in circular arguments about moral duty, much like Kant's kind of anemic categorical imperative when it's under a lot of scrutiny or tension. Now, the counterexample to this would be Rorty's public-private split. Of course, it's very appealing and tidy, but it ignores how personal beliefs shape public action. If I'm privately ironic about justice, doubting it's just a word, how do I sincerely fight for it publicly? Think of activists like Martin Luther King Jr., whose public crusades were really fueled by a deeply personal, non-ironic faith in universal dignity. So Rorty's firewall, it might actually weaken your convictions here, splitting the self in ways that actually dilute commitment rather than adding to it. So our key takeaway from this is that the liberal Ironist balances private irony with public anti-cruelty, but Rorty's split risks kind of fracturing moral integrity. Step 4. Exemplars of irony. Proust, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Derrida. Rorty showcases Ironists like Proust, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Derrida, who craft unique selves through private redescription. Proust's In Search of Lost Time, it weaves memories into a self that could not have existed without his metaphors. That's actually what led to him being so unique. Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra rejects universal truths, inventing the overman with aphorisms and metaphors. Heidegger's Being in Time, that redescribes the self as being in the world, contingent on history. Derrida's deconstruction, especially in Of Grammatology, plays with language, exposing metaphysics, shaky binaries, and things like presence/absence. Now, Rorty argues that all these projects are actually private, not public threats. He writes that Derrida's work is best treated as a private project of philosophical play, rather than a public theory. Their irony inspires autonomy without undermining liberal hope, as long as it stays personal. So Rorty, as an example here, he kind of chides Habermas, a metaphysician, for being unwilling to be an Ironist, accusing him of wanting to rationalize rather than poeticize. He also critiques Foucault, which I'm all for, an Ironist unwilling to be a liberal, whose public authenticity risks prioritizing a social goal over avoiding cruelty. Rorty exposes their logical bind here. Habermas seeks universal foundations, Foucault, universal rebellion, and both of them miss the pragmatic middle. So the counterexample to all of this is that Rorty's privatization of irony assumes that it won't leak into public life. But history disagrees. Nietzsche's ideas, of course meant for private self-creation, inspired public ideologies like fascism, showing how irony can escape containment. So Rorty's neat divisions here, they underestimate how private vocabularies shape public actions, and that risks unintended consequences. So, yeah, our key takeaway for this section is Ironists like Proust and Derrida inspire private autonomy, but Rorty's containment strategy overlooks their public ripple effects. Step 5. Solidarity and social hope. This is imagination versus essence. Rorty's liberal Ironist redefines solidarity not as a common human essence, but as imaginative identification with others' pain. He writes, solidarity is not discovered by reflection, but created through narratives like Dickens' Bleak House that really detail suffering. Ironists end up basing solidarity upon a common danger, that is, the recognition of a common susceptibility to humiliation. Metaphysicians, conversely, they seek a universal vocabulary highlighting a shared power, like rationality or truth. And so Rorty argues that Ironists can't offer metaphysicians some sort of social hope grounded in truth, since freedom actually depends on historical contingencies, weapons, and luck. Instead, they use redescription. The Ironist uses redescription to answer what humiliates. An example of this is Rorty, when he critiques Kant's universalism, he argues that it assumes reason as a common core. Now, he says that Kant's focus on rational respect over pity makes cruelty seem somehow second-rate. This is a logical error that sidelines empathy. So Rorty jabs here, saying that Kant's purity traps him in a peculiar institution of morality, which is disconnected from real suffering. Now, a level of skepticism here is that Rorty's reliance on narrative for solidarity is powerful, because, of course, humans love stories, but it's also fragile. If solidarity hinges on stories, what happens when narratives clash or propaganda just drowns out empathy? Now, Kant's universal principles, though abstract, they once again provide a fallback to judge competing claims. Rorty's contingency leaves us all vulnerable to narrative manipulation, much like in Orwell's 1984. So our key takeaway here is that Ironists create solidarity through imagination, but Rorty's narrative-driven approach risks instability without universal anchors. So our conclusion? Rorty's Part 2 here, chapters 4 through 6, paints a vivid clash. Ironists wielding doubt and redescription versus metaphysicians chasing universal truth. Now, the liberal Ironist is his hero, balancing private self-creation with public anti-cruelty, inspired by figures like Proust and Derrida. Rorty's prose here, it really sparkles and, shines, and his critique of Plato and Kant and Habermas do expose philosophy's kind of logical knots of what they were trying to do. Now, as he writes, anything could be made to look good or bad by being redescribed, empowering us to really craft our new selves and new solidarities. But of course, I'm wary, right? Rorty splits between the public and private. It feels somehow artificial to me. And his rejection of universal truths leaves moral action shaky. Can irony sustain commitment when conviction wanes? I don't know. But next time, in Step 88, we'll dive into Part 3, and we're going to explore cruelty and solidarity through Nabokov and Orwell. And maybe I'll push back a little harder, arguing that Rorty's framework might undermine the very hope he champions. Now, until then, keep questioning your vocabulary. This is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It.